The Wealth of Some Nations. Chapter 11 Conclusion. The primary concern of the labor aristocracy has always been its material differentiation from the mass of the working class as a bounded and superordinate fraction thereof. Thus, for example, Communist Party Chairman Bill Andrews championed an industrial color bar in South Africa at the Mines Commission of 1908, compelling the Transvaal Native Congress to lobby the colonial capitalist Chamber of Mines to protect African miners from these policies. As economic historian Bill Freund writes of South Africa's settler colonial society, beginning of long quote, labor, citizenship, and society were linked in complex ways that reflected a long historical development for the exploitation of black labor. A white working class that was racially bounded profited from this system, rather like the class assessments of worker aristocracies of Lenin and Luxembourg, used to help explain the collusion of worker organizations in policies of imperialism and war in the West, while the poorly paid workers of color provided the core of profitable value. End of long quote. Above all, the labor aristocracy has struggled to hold itself apart from the reserve army of labor and its destabilizing economic, political, and ideological influence on more or less permanent terms. As capitalism has developed into a truly international system of production, the social dimensions of the reserve army of labor have become indissociable from the hierarchical national boundaries established by imperialism. The labor aristocracy has moved from pressing for closed shops to demanding closed borders, with its relative employment precarity determined by its location at the apex of the global labor market. As such, the intent on the part of a great many metropolitan workers to oppress, disenfranchise, and exclude immigrants from full citizenship is not merely based on actual or potential competition over just any jobs, but rather over the very best jobs capitalism has to offer. The mass xeno-racism of metropolitan labor is an expression of labor aristocratic support for an imperialist system that subjects foreign nations in order to monopolize their natural resources and capital. That global imperialism has found it necessary to admit persons from semi-colonial countries across its borders for economic, diplomatic, political, and other reasons, and has consistently met with the disapproval of the metropolitan workforce. This has only intensified as Keynesian social democracy has been replaced with neoliberal economic restructuring and the accompanying rise of the racialized police state. Indeed, the superwages of metropolitan labor not only depend upon militarized borders and job market discrimination, but also on the degree to which metropolitan workers can influence state policy in their own favor. In the absence of social democratic and trade union vehicles, appropriate to an earlier phase of labor aristocratic organization, First World democracy finds its sine qua non in the same racist national chauvinism, increasingly embraced by capital in crisis. It is crucial to understand, then, that the anti-immigrant sentiment of native metropolitan labor is not solely the product of parochial or racist idiocy, though that assuredly follows. Absent an internationalist and socialist response, the oversupply of labor power relative to employers' demand for it enhances the bargaining power of capitalists and degrades that of workers. As such, nativism has clear economic dynamics and is rooted in working-class attempts to assert authority. Indeed, many on the left argue that immigration from low-wage countries to high-wage countries, the real object of the immigration debate as such, tends to lower wage levels in the latter, and is therefore a reactionary policy that socialists should oppose. Typically, these critics insist that it is only a tiny plutocratic elite in the global north that benefits from global exploitation, poverty, and war, and that, therefore, northern labor ought not to have to suffer any assault on its living standards as a result. To argue for maintaining wages in the highly developed countries at their current level, however, whether consciously or not, is in fact to demand the continuation of value transfer from the less developed countries. Since it is precisely this which is responsible for mass migration to the global metropoles, the desire to escape the poverty and war wrought by imperialism for the riches brought by imperialism, it is impossible to oppose the migration of workers from the low-wage countries to the high-wage imperialist countries from a socialist perspective. Imperialist depredation is both logically and chronologically prior to mass migration from the oppressed nations, and it is both erroneous and deeply reactionary to treat the latter as a problem that can and should be solved on its own terms, that is, by means of placing restrictions on international labor mobility. Inevitably, quote, socialists, seeking to advance the class interests of the metropolitan labor aristocracy, are compelled to defend the first world border regimes that cement global wage differentials. Meanwhile, those individuals and groups who combine anti-imperialist rhetoric with anti-immigrant politics simply provide, quote, left cover for a profoundly fascistic attack on those workers whose presence endangers metropolitan monopolies on high-wage labor. A century ago, Lenin described the reality behind the pseudo-socialist nativism of the metropolitan labor aristocracy. Beginning of long quote. In our struggle for true internationalism and against jingo socialism, we always quote in our press the example of the opportunist leaders of the SP, Socialist Party in America, who are in favor of restrictions on the immigration of Chinese and Japanese workers, especially after the Congress of Stuttgart, 1907, and against the decisions of Stuttgart. We think that one cannot be internationalist and be at the same time in favor of such restrictions. And we assert that socialists in America, especially English socialists, belonging to the ruling and oppressing nation, who are not against any restrictions of immigration, against the possession of colonies, Hawaii, and for the entire freedom of the colonies, that such socialists are in reality jingos. End of long quote. The, quote, socialism of the native workforce of the major imperialist countries today, the world's richest by a large margin, is characterized by an imperialist economism that refuses to acknowledge the need to prioritize the struggle for an end to the militarism and neocolonialism that typifies the capitalist world system. By confining itself to demanding the betterment of its own conditions by any means, including by repudiating solidarity with the world's most exploited wage earners dispossessed by imperialism, the National Socialism of the metropolitan labor aristocracy and its intellectual and political champions is destined to lead it to the social fascist embrace of business nationalists and imperialist expansionists. To summarize, the occupation of indigenous land establishes the basis for settler land ownership. The employment of a specially oppressed layer of the metropolitan working class in lower wage occupations yields discrimination profits, and the enclosure of specially oppressed metropolitan workers in such occupations yields discrimination wages. Meanwhile, the imperialist exploitation of foreign labor generates metropolitan super profits and allows for metropolitan super wages. We may thus conclude this part of the present work by defining the modern labor aristocracy in the following terms. As capitalism comes increasingly to form an international system of commodity production, the labor aristocracy is thereby constituted as a superordinate section of the workforce, whose relative affluence derives from the politically secured exploitation of subordinate national groups within a system of imperialism. Insofar as it is able to capture or maintain a dominant position in the labor market established by means of the latter, in particular, in the context of militarized borders and relatively exclusive access to training and employment opportunities in sectors dependent upon value transfer. The labor aristocracy guarantees its receipt of superwages, that is, wages incrementally higher than the median value of labor power internationally. At the extreme end of the scale, superwages are those wages approaching or in excess of the per capita value of labor in the capitalist world system. In other words, superwages are those wages which cost more international labor time than their recipients themselves contribute, and thus represent what Hosea Jaffe called negative surplus value. Whether or not a group of workers is superexploited is obvious insofar as that involves the payment of subsistence wages. To determine whether a particular group of workers is exploited is more difficult, however, and cannot, of course, be linked to either levels of oppression or to the receipt of wages as such. We argue that determining levels of exploitation for different groups of workers requires comparing the wage bundle, W1, quantity of goods and services afforded by the sale of labor power, of workers in Group A to the wage bundle W2, of the totality of workers in Group B involved in the production of W1. That is, to determine whether workers in Group A are able to purchase with 1 hour of their labor a greater amount of Group B's labor as a condition of institutionally different rates of exploitation, those established by imperialism. We argue that a minority of the world's workers, those living in the developed countries, effectively consumes more of the world's labor than it contributes itself. End of section.